Hello and welcome. In this lecture, we're going to be talking a little bit about comics. And in doing so, we're going to talk about how comic book artists make decisions around how to convey messages, how to assemble the comics, and how to convey meaning to their audience. Now, if you're like me, very often when you think about comics, you might go back to your childhood and the comic strips that we'd read in the newspaper. I have a long-standing and continuing love of Calvin and Hobbes, for example. And for most of my childhood, this is how I thought of comics, as sort of a diversion and entertainment. This is partially for a reason. So in the 1950s or so, comics, which had been really coming into its own in the early 1900s, started to come under political criticism. There's a book, The Seduction of the Innocent, where the idea is that comics are converting children to these awful things of various sorts and promoting heathenism and promiscuity and violence and other types of things like that. And there was the Comics Code, which was put out. So they would put these stamps on the comic books to essentially say that they've been approved for public consumption for children. And for a very long time, because of this sort of scenario, comics were not taken seriously as a medium for communication or art, really. And that stigma really carried through even into my younger years. When I was in my teens and 20s, I didn't read comic books because I thought that they just weren't worth my time. And that's part of the stigma that was built around comic books. Now, I didn't personally start paying attention to comic books until I visited a friend's house and I had some free time and I sat down and read a book that he had, a graphic novel that he had there, Watchmen. It was a bit too violent for me, but I enjoyed it. And, what was interesting to me is I visited him again about a year ago and I saw the same book on the shelf. And what really struck me almost immediately was the fact that I remembered the entire story. Now, if I read a book, the chances of me remembering it in any great detail a year later is very small. I hate to say it. I wish I had a better memory, but I just don't. So why I suddenly became very curious about this was, why did I remember this book when a typical book I would not? And in thinking about it, I came to some conclusions around that. One was, when you're reading a comic book, you have both the narrative, the story, but you also have visual elements too, and the combination of those are really powerful. The other thing about it is, unlike a movie where you're churning through it and they sort of spit you out after 2 hours or something, with a comic book, you read it at your own pace and absorb it in your own pace. And for me, at least, I think that the combination of those factors really made comics very impactful and allowed me to remember it in ways that other types of media did not have the same type of impact. So for me personally, that's sort of my initial interest in graphic novels, and have become a fan since then. Now, comics are getting a lot more attention across a wide range of different purposes, but one area is graphic medicine, where comics are increasingly being used in healthcare and for medical purposes, both in healthcare systems and medicine, and also in public health as well. And it's used in a few different ways. The first is to explain to someone about a health problem, to provide information about health. And that's just a provision of information. And that's quite common. In fact, a lot of the diagrams that you see out there, in terms of explaining how to use different things and they show people using them, those are actually really comics, even though we think of them as graphics, for example. The second use that these comics are sometimes used for are for sharing stories and experiences that people have with health. And this can be very powerful as a way for people to understand a health condition and to connect with it. And in preparing for this lecture, I actually looked at a fair number of papers that were exploring this. And it's relatively new that this is being explored in detail using empirical research. But the research is suggesting that one recollection of this type of information tends to be a little bit higher for most people. It seems to work a little bit better across different literacy levels because you have that pairing of pictures with words. It also stretches it out so it isn't quite as dense as handing someone a piece of paper that is dense text. And, it combines a range of different elements of the written word and visual word and can sometimes create a friendly connection with the reader. And especially when you're talking about stories, for some people, it can help combat stigma around the disease. It can help one understand what to expect from a disease, raise awareness. If a disease has embarrassing elements to it, it might build that connection to it. So point here being that graphic novels have some interesting potential for engaging with people around health-related issues. And there's a lot of interest in this right now, and we'll see some examples of that in our materials for the course. Now, comics are also being used as a communication medium for talking about climate change. Most of what I've seen for this has been in essentially political comic form, basically single panels. But you see a range of different ones. You see it ranging from this comic, which is sort of talking about the experience of climate change, and it's titled The Ambivalence of a Nice Day in February. And the guy's saying, so doomed, right? To other comics which are trying to talk about the science of climate change, where, they talk about a UW study actually looking at conditions and raising concern about those conditions that we're seeing as we see carbon emissions accumulating in the atmosphere. So climate change certainly is also a complex issue that sometimes can be made engaging through comic book form. So how do we analyze comics? Well, first off, I should just compare comics to other forms of art forms. Is comic books literature? Well, in some ways it is, in the sense that there's written form, there's typically text that tells a story. So a lot of the elements that we think about with critiquing literature actually apply to comic books. However, it also has a strong visual element. So it's not just a written story, it's also a story where you're visually engaging with this, and the artist is also providing their imagery into the story in forms other than just words. Is it drawing? Well, certainly there's a lot of visual elements to the art, but it's not just drawing because, one, it has a sequential element, so you're looking at multiple panels together. So it's not a single drawing that you're looking at, it's usually many drawings combined. And then secondly, you also have that very strong word component to the storyline that's narrating what's going on there. So it doesn't quite fit that category too, although most of the analysis strategies that we've talked about for drawing are actually applicable to comics as well. What about film? Well, films are essentially multiple panels that are put together really fast, and we see it and it combines together into a film. So in some ways, it works like a film. It has both the narrative and the visual element. But it's somewhat different in the sense that you're in control of the speed that you go through this. You can stop, you can think about it, and you also make leaps of logic through closure, which I'll talk about later. That makes it a little bit different than film. Also, when you're looking at a page, in comic books, you have still images. And sometimes still images can convey things that get missed when things are moving really fast, as in a film. So point here is that although comic books share a lot of the elements that we see for other types of arts, it does have some unique elements to it that are worth thinking about, that are kind of interesting. So I'm going to return to a book that I've already referred to, Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud, which is a very widely recognized as being a major theoretical framework for thinking about comics, and really advanced our understanding of it as an art form. So we've already talked a little bit about some of the concepts that come out of this book, the idea that we have this transition, the picture plane, that goes from the specific, say, photorealism, all the way to the iconic, which is that very simple face there, and then going all the way from realism up to the abstract at the top, where there's no real story that's being told anymore. The content is being moved away from to emphasize color or shape or the art element to that work. And then to the side, you also see face, or the actual use of letters, which is sort of the extreme of that motion from the specific to the iconic. Now, when we think about comics, comic artists use this whole range of the picture plane. And this is just a interesting graphic that McLeod put together, looking at all the different types of art, comic book art that's out there, and showing how it really does fill a wide scope of different types of art types within that picture plane. Now, another thing that we've already talked about is the idea of how art is created, which is very applicable to comic books as to any other type of art, where we have the idea, the form, the idiom, the structure, craft, and service, and how it's a combination of those elements that help us to come to an understanding of what art actually means. Now, let's move to talk a little bit more about comic book as an art form, and we can think about it historically in many ways. So comic approaches that sequential art is something that's been going on for ages, both in South American art, Egyptian art, European art. You will see art has for a very long time showed sequential images that tell a story. They're trying to convey some sort of message or connect with the reader around a concept, right? So this is something we've been doing for a very long time. And if we're thinking about how to define that, Scott McLeod has put forth the idea that we should describe comics as being juxtaposed pictorial or other images in a deliberate sequence. So the idea here is that we're having multiple images that are being put together to convey a message, in this deliberate sequence. All right. So what about a cartoon? Well, a cartoon is not a comic. A cartoon is using some of those iconic forms that we see in comics, but it's not multiple multiple cartoons in sequence, which would make a comic. So here, this is an image that is not juxtaposed, and therefore it's not a comic. Now, I want to talk about a couple elements to comics that are kind of unique and interesting. One is the way, when we think about the picture plane and the spectrum from specific to iconic, that simplification is actually a very frequently used method in comic art. So we look at some of these very famous images of cartoon figures that have existed for a long time, and people truly love a lot of these figures that are being represented there. And the question would be, it's very simple. These are very simple images. Why do we actually connect with them so much? Why do we actually like comics so much? Why do people really engage in some sort of way? It doesn't really make sense. You would imagine that you'd feel more connection to something that looks more real, that feels more connecting, right? Well, what McLeod argues is that there is essentially a spectrum here from, again, that pictorial image all the way to the very simple and iconic. And what cartoonists do is they actually, by pulling out detail, they're focusing us in more on the detail that they want to provide, right? So as they become more simple, they can clarify the meaning of what they're trying to convey. So cartoonists, depending on what types of messages they're trying to provide, or what type of story they're trying to tell, will make an informed choice about where along that spectrum they want to be. Now, the other element to this is that is kind of facing is the way that we project ourselves into a story. So when you have a very detailed image, we see that person as being someone else, right? That person is not us. They're someone else who has their own life experience, and they are separate from me. However, as you become more and more iconic, it becomes to project yourself into that image. That, this circle with two dots and a line could just as easily be me as someone down the hall or someone I pass on the road. This is an image that could be an image of me, right? And therefore, when we see this abstraction of comics, or the iconic forms of comics, this actually provides us with an opportunity to connect personally to that comic in a different sort of way. Now, when we think about comics not just as the image of people, but we think about the overall image and background, this effect of projection can sometimes be used in interesting ways. For example, there's a process called masking, where we see here that you have the person in the comic be this sort of iconic image that is very simple, right? And that allows the reader to project themselves into that character. However, the surrounding, the background in that comic is very detailed and rich and complex. And this provides an interesting sort of effect where it allows you to project into the comic and become engaged as a person in that comic. But the surroundings are very detailed, so you can have this rich, vibrant world that you're imagining through that art. So that masking effect is kind of an interesting thing that cartoon artists sometimes do. Pretty interesting. So how do comics engage people in imagination? Well, there's a process called closure, which is pretty fascinating, that helps us understand how comics are received by an audience. So here we see 5 images where you see someone walking down, seeing something, reaching up and then reaching down, touching their toes, and then standing up again, right? And when we read that, we typically imply motion in that, right? As opposed to seeing them as entirely independent images, right? And that's our brains essentially engaging in closure. And closure is something that we cognitively do in all sorts of situations. There are a lot of things where, object permanence, or the idea that if we see certain letters, we can put together a word even though we don't see all of those elements of the word. Or we can look at something like the dots in there and somehow see the word coming through, even though it's not entirely spelled out in the same way, right? So our brains are actually very good at taking images, taking components of things, and pushing them together to make meaning out of them. Now, there are different types of closure that you see in comics. One is at the top might be moment to moment. So here you see someone looking and then blinking, right? So here we see that very slow narration of what's going on. You could also see action to action. Someone's getting ready to swing and then you see the swing, right? You could also have subject to subject. So you're in the same image and following motion, but you're going from one place to another in that image. You could also have scene to scene, right? So you're having one story. So here the person is saying, that person can't hide forever. And then the next scene is saying 10 years later, you're assuming that picture is the house of the person who's been hiding for 10 years, right? So we're going from one scene to another. Then aspect to aspect is another way that you can engage with closure. And that's where you're showing multiple images that aren't necessarily bound by time or some sort of connected narrative, but they're images that are separately trying to describe a scene, to give a vision of what a scene might look like. So pictures of different objects or things like that to set the scene that one is in. And then you have the non sequitur, which is kind of an interesting one, where you have things that are put together but are kind of random. What's interesting about this, even though they are random, brains actually are very good, even with non sequiturs, at sort of making stories around these random images, because our brains are so trained to create closure around things, even if the connection doesn't even exist. So how does closure occur? Well, it's kind of interesting. Closure occurs in many ways in what we call the gutter. And the gutter is essentially the space between the panels in a comic, right? So here, we have this image of someone being attacked, and then we have yeah, right? And the word yeah, and we're assuming that person got killed in between. So the assumed motion, the assumed act, the assumed event happens in the gutter, right? And that's actually a process of closure. So what we're doing by having that gutter, by having that there, is forcing people to engage in imagination. And that's really an important clue for us as to why people engage with comics so much, is we're requiring them, by connecting these images, to engage in cognitively processing the images to understand what's going on in that story. And this is, again, that powerful participation. The participation element in that closure is crucial because it helps us connect to it, to be curious, to engage with it, and participate in the creation of a story. The other thing about this that is kind of interesting is that comics is a visual media. We look at the comic and we read with our eyes, and we see pictures and we put them together, right? But in the gutter, in between those images, as we're engaging with closure, that's entirely open. That's entirely empty. So we can engage our other four senses in that. So we can imagine hearing, we can imagine tasting things, we can imagine a scene in a much more complex way, essentially in that process of closure, right? So it's a way of connecting with the audience that is pretty fascinating. There's other choices that artists make in terms of designing closure. One is how panels are arranged. They can sometimes be confusing or not, but the arrangement of how the story proceeds can be very important to the story itself. You can even think about the panels being adjusted in terms of shape to convey different types of meaning. So like the jagged picture there might be the shape of the panel itself is providing information about what's going on there. Perhaps there's some sort of dramatic thing that's trying to be conveyed. Panels can also be used to convey time, right? So we see three different sort of comic strips, and this is just illustrating the way that having multiple panels sometimes add in time. So someone asks a question and there's an answer. The first, you kind of assume that there's rapid progression. The second two are sort of ways that you can see that having multiple panels or actually changing the shape of the panel implies a length of time in that image, right? Kind of interesting. You can also use balloons to convey image. So here we have ways in which the shape of the balloon can change image. We also use different images within the balloon to convey different ideas, like questions or sleep or other types of things. And we have that language that goes on there. And we combine that together, I think also, especially with things like sounds, right? So the benefit of this is, although comics is a visual media, there's many ways in which comics bring in sounds into them so that you can have a broader experience for the reader. You can also do things like motion lines. So we've come to understand that when we see those lines behind the image, there's things that are going on. So even though we're having still images and we're creating closure across different panels, we are integrating that motion into the image, right, as well. There's also sort of some interesting elements that comics have essentially a visual language, where there's certain things where having certain images, we understand what they mean. And that's because we've read comics over the years. So we know that different images imply different states for an individual, like being drunk or moving really fast or being dizzy, for example, right? So there's all these tools that we use to convey meaning. Now, when we think about comic book artists and how they approach their art, it varies widely. And we've talked already about the art creation process and the picture plane. And we've also talked a little bit about artists, how artists have different styles. And this is just as true for comic book art. And we see here just some pictorial examples of the wide ranges of ways that artists can use line and composition to convey very different meanings and feels to the art that they produce. You can also use color, as we've already talked about. Color can be used to express mood. It can be used to create dynamic images that create depth, or color can be just beautiful and art in and of itself within the comic itself. So there's real elements in which color, which originally was much more difficult to integrate into comics because it was expensive to add color, but now it's become more available. It really is an important and valuable tool for comic artists. Now, another thing about comics is the pacing of that comic. So how much detail, how fast does it go? Here's a story where we have this exact same story told in, 20 or so panels, and the same story is told in about 2 panels, right? Don't get drunk, Carl. I promise I won't. And then you see R.I.P. Carl. Carl dies because he got drunk, right? So different artists will have different pacing to their story that will be shown and illustrated using different types of panel construction, different types of motion, different types of stories that are conveyed there. And that's very important for setting the mood and trajectory of a story. The other thing that's kind of interesting is as we move into thinking about comics is the way that images are combined with text and story. So there's three major ways that occurs. One is you can show an image and the image itself can be saying what it's trying to say. So the first image, you see someone trying as hard as they can. They're really active. And you might have to look at that and understand and think about that image to understand that, but you could probably pick up on that to some extent from the image itself. Then you see an image combined with the words. And here, it's a narrative within the story where someone's announcing this. He's giving it his all, folks, right? And that's where you're just conveying dialogue within the comic. And then the third is where you have this narrator that's outside of the story saying he was giving it his all when. So you're telling the story through those panels at the top. And they actually use balloons and panels in different ways to describe this. And we've actually understand that as a language of comics. So you could tell the exact same story using all words, and that would be essentially a written story, or you could tell the same story just using images, right? And this is kind of a fascinating balance. And the ratio of those is a choice that artists make in terms of how they tell a story. So if you have a lot of pictures, what it does is it actually allows the pictures are carrying the weight of the story. So you could tell a story with pictures where you see someone going through motions or actions, and your narrative could be about what's going on in their head, or it could be something unrelated. And you could still continue with the story, and people would understand that story. Or you could tell a story with words, and that would free up the pictures to then go and carry out other types of things, to illustrate a scene or do the aspect to aspect kind of element to things, right? So the ratio between using words or pictures to convey meaning actually is an important element to comic book art. Now, McLeod points out that ratio is important and that in some ways there's a give and take to that, and that the best art, in his opinion at least, is artwork, comic book art, where there's a give and take and a flow between using pictures and words to convey meaning. Now, some people might disagree with it. There's certainly comic book art that has almost no words in it, and that can be really impactful too. Or comic book art that uses a lot of words to try and explain complex ideas, and sometimes that can be valuable as well. But it's an interesting element in terms of artistic choice. All right, so that's a quick rundown of comic book art and how it works. I have always really enjoyed this art form, and I'm really excited about the attention that's been getting, really over the last 20, 30 years that's really been taken seriously. And I'm really also quite interested in the potential that it has for conveying both health-related information and climate change-related information, and as a tool for really connecting with an audience, engaging with the audience. All right, so thank you very much. That's about it now. So take care and be well.